Imagine a train station where the ceiling reaches 45 meters, taller than a 15-story building. A station decorated with pink granite and 84 columns, copied from Roman baths. A station that architects of the time called the most beautiful structure in America. Now imagine it being torn down, not by bombing, not by an earthquake. It was dismantled by hand, bolt by bolt, column by column, by the decision of a handful of men in suits who decided that the land underneath it was worth more than the building itself. Today, pieces of this station are scattered across the United States. From a zoo in Washington to a small island in the state of Maine, hundreds and thousands of kilometers from where they were meant to stand. And here's the strangest part. The very same people who destroyed this station would be stopped by the country's highest court 15 years later, when they tried to do the same thing to its neighbor. But more on that at the end of this video. This is the story of how New York built its greatest architectural treasure, smashed it to rubble with its own hands, and how that very tragedy ended up saving thousands of other buildings around the world. Hey everyone! And today we're digging into one of the most controversial stories in 20th century architecture, the destruction of the original Penn Station in New York City. This isn't just a story about an old, beautiful building that got torn down. It's a story about deadly construction work under a riverbed, about money, pride, the decline of railroads, and about how public outrage over this loss literally changed landmark preservation laws around the world. So get comfortable. We're starting in 1900, when one man decided that New York needed a train station worthy of Imperial Rome. By the end of the 19th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest corporation in the world, with a network of tracks stretching over 16,000 kilometers. But there was one humiliating catch. The trains of this mighty company couldn't actually reach Manhattan. The island was cut off from the mainland by the Hudson and East Rivers, and passengers had to disembark from trains in New Jersey, then cross the river by ferry. The company's president, Alexander Cassatt, found this humiliating. In 1901, during a trip to Paris, he visited the newly opened Gare d'Orsay, the world's first electrified railway terminal. The sight convinced him. If trains could run underground on electricity, without smoke or soot, then Manhattan could be conquered with tunnels right under the riverbeds. It sounds like an engineering gamble, and it truly was one. Attempts to dig a tunnel under the Hudson had been made before. Back in 1879, contractor DeWitt Haskins began digging a tunnel, but the slick, muddy riverbed turned out to be a deadly trap. A massive blowout flooded the tunnel, and 20 workers died right there underwater. The men who worked under increased air pressure to hold back the water and mud were called sandhogs. It was one of the most dangerous professions in America. Men worked in compressed air chambers and then suffered from decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends, nitrogen bubbling in the blood from rapid pressure changes. Once Cassatt's team began building the tunnels under the Hudson in 1904, an entirely unexpected problem emerged. Engineers discovered that the tunnels were moving, literally rising and sinking in the mud by up to half a meter. For 2 years, engineers tried to figure out why, until they realized the tunnels were moving in sync with the tides of the river. The sheer weight of the water mass above the tunnel changed twice a day, and the structure reacted to it almost like a living organism. Some engineers insisted on installing additional supports down to bedrock. Others considered it unnecessary and risky. In the end, they decided not to install them. And the tunnels are still there today, moving with the tides, more than 100 years later. Despite all the risks, both tunnels under the Hudson were joined in 1906, while another team was simultaneously digging tunnels under the East River toward Queens. It was one of the most complex engineering projects of its time. No other railroad company in America dared attempt anything like it at that moment. And even before anyone started digging, the company pulled off an entire secret real estate operation. Through a front company called the Stuyvesant Real Estate Company, the Pennsylvania Railroad quietly began buying up land in the Tenderloin district on the west side of Manhattan, a neighborhood full of cheap hotels and buildings of questionable reputation. The land was bought under a different name precisely so the owners wouldn't realize what was really happening and jack up prices. In the end, more than 500 individual buildings were demolished to make way for the station. An entire city block vanished from the map before a single sketch of the future facade even existed. What was supposed to rise from the mouths of these tunnels was a station that would become the calling card of the entire city. Cassatt hired the architectural firm McKim, Mead and White, one of the most influential in America, the authors of dozens of government and cultural buildings. The architects drew their inspiration from the Baths of Caracalla, ancient Roman baths, one of the most grandiose public structures of antiquity. The station's main hall had a ceiling over 45 meters high and stretched a block and a half long. At the time of its opening, it was the largest enclosed space in all of New York City. Construction of the station and its adjoining tunnels cost the company roughly $114 million. That's over $2.7 billion in today's money that on November 27, 1910, the station opened its doors. On the very first day alone, more than 100,000 people came through it. Newspapers wrote about it as the eighth wonder of the world. One of America's most famous architectural historians, Vincent Scully, would later say that arriving in New York through this station felt like entering like a god. Sadly, the project's founder, Alexander Cassatt, had already died in 1906, for years before the opening, never living to see his dream completed. A statue of him was placed right in the main hall of the station, a building he himself never got to see. The facade itself was practically covered in symbolism. Sculptor Adolf Weinman created 22 massive granite and marble eagles for it, a symbol of power and travel, along with 4 pairs of allegorical female figures named Day and Night. One held sunflowers and looked down at passengers. The other wore a stern expression and a hooded cloak. The model for the faces of these figures was Audrey Munson, one of the most famous sculptor's models of the time, whose face graced dozens of public monuments across America. Every single detail had one goal: to convince every passenger that arriving in New York was an occasion worthy of ancient emperors. For the next 3 decades, Penn Station was the beating heart of the East Coast's transportation system. It lived through 2 world wars. This was where millions of American soldiers departed for the front and where they returned to. The peak of its popularity came in 1945. That year, roughly 100 million passengers passed through the station, a record that symbolized America's absolute trust in the railroad. But that record turned out to be the last triumph before a long decline. After World War II, America changed forever. Affordable air travel emerged. Interstate highways were being built. Families moved en masse to the suburbs and bought cars. Railroads began rapidly losing passengers and maintaining a gigantic, luxurious station, with its marble, granite, and glass roofs, cost the Pennsylvania Railroad a genuine fortune every single year. By the mid-1950s, the once palatial travel hall looked completely different. A layer of grime covered the walls. The pink granite had turned gray. Billboards plastered the columns of the main hall, and shops and diners took over the space around the concourse, looking more like a bazaar than the entrance to an architectural masterpiece. Architecture critic Louis Mumford wrote in 1958 that the building could no longer be damaged any further. It had already fallen that far. There was a bitter irony in all of this. The station itself never actually stopped being needed by the city. Even in the years of its worst decline, tens of thousands of passengers still passed through it daily, commuters heading to and from work. The problem wasn't a lack of demand for the transit hub itself. It was that maintaining this particular, excessively luxurious version of the station no longer made economic sense to a company counting every dollar. The Pennsylvania Railroad saw only one way out: sell the company's most valuable asset, the land underneath the station. That if you're curious how a single real estate deal led to the destruction of an architectural gem, stick around, because the most dramatic part of this story is coming up next, including exactly who took to the streets to protest it. By the way, if you enjoy content about forgotten and destroyed architectural masterpieces, subscribe. I've got plenty more stories like this one. In 1954, the leadership of the Pennsylvania Railroad struck a deal with developer William Zeckendorf, selling the air rights above the station. Even then, the idea of demolishing the main building and replacing it with something more commercially profitable was already being discussed. In 1962, that idea took its final shape. The company announced a plan to build a new complex on the site of the station, an office tower, a hotel, and a sports arena called Madison Square Garden. In exchange for the rights to this land, the Pennsylvania Railroad would receive a smaller underground station, essentially for free, plus a 25% stake in the new complex. The company's president at the time, Stuart Saunders, openly defended this decision. He said outright that in 50 years, when it came time to tear down Madison Square Garden itself, a new generation of architects would protest it just the same. In other words, he viewed the protests of doomed architects as simply a natural cycle, not something worth taking seriously. But the architectural community wasn't staying quiet. When the plan was made public, a wave of shock rippled through New York. 5 young architects, among them Elliot Wilinski, Peter Samton, and Jordan Grusin, founded a group called AGBNY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York. On August 2, 1962, they organized a picket line at the station's main entrance. Among the hundreds of participants were people whose names every architecture or urban planning student knows today: writer Jane Jacobs, architect Philip Johnson, critic Aline Saarinen. Protesters carried signs reading things like "Don't amputate, renovate," "Action, not apathy," and "Don't sell our city." Newspapers wrote that it was probably the best-dressed picket line in New York City history. Dozens of architects in expensive suits stopping passing commuters right on the street, asking them to sign a petition. In January 1963, AGBNY even filed an official brief with the City Planning Commission, arguing that the land under the station had already been officially designated for public use and couldn't be handed over to a private sports arena. But none of it changed the authorities' decision one bit. In January 1963, the New York City Department of City Planning voted to begin demolishing the building that very summer. On October 28, 1963, early in the morning, under a light rain, the destruction of the station's above-ground structure began. Picketers wearing black mourning armbands watched silently as electric jackhammers struck marble for the first time. The process didn't take weeks. It took years, dragging on until 1966. A temporary steel platform was built over the tracks so trains could keep running even as the building above them was torn apart. Photographs exist showing passengers literally waiting for a train while, above their heads, a crane dismantles the columns of a temple built by their parents' generation. Architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable, who published one scathing column after another in the New York Times, wrote in her piece marking the completion of the demolition that Penn Station had died at the age of 56 after a long decline, and that this fact made it unmistakably clear. In this city, the value of real estate mattered more than preserving the past. And the New York Times, in its own editorial at the time, noted that before the first hammer blow, almost no one truly believed that New York would allow this act of vandalism against one of the greatest monuments of its era. The most haunting photographs appeared right in the middle of the process, in the summer of 1965. Images show the station's main hall, where part of the glass roof and columns had already been dismantled, yet passengers were still standing in line for tickets right under the open sky, amid construction dust and rubble. Commuters walked past this destruction on their way to work every single day, gradually growing used to something that would have seemed unthinkable just a year earlier. The story's bitterest irony didn't reveal itself right away. It took decades. Today, the underground Penn Station is the busiest transit hub in the entire Western Hemisphere, with more than 600,000 passengers passing through it daily. In other words, the very argument used to justify the demolition, that rail travel was dying out and a station of that scale was no longer needed, turned out to be completely wrong. The demand for rail travel never disappeared. Only the station worthy of that demand did. There's one detail of this story that rarely gets told, but it's remarkably telling. The station's facade was adorned with 22 massive granite and marble eagles by sculptor Adolf Weinman, each weighing several tons. When the demolition began, most of the stone was simply hauled off to a dump in the New Jersey marshes. But the eagles were the one thing people started rescuing, literally by hand, before the wrecking crane could smash them to gravel. Today, 6 decades later, historians have tracked down nearly all of them, scattered across the country in thoroughly unexpected places. One eagle sits beside a college football field in Virginia. Another rests on the grounds of the National Zoo in Washington, right next to the birdhouse. Yet another ended up on Vinyl Haven Island in the state of Maine, the very place where the pink granite for the station was originally quarried. 2 smaller eagles decorate a Boy Scout memorial fountain in Kansas City, smack in the middle of the country, thousands of kilometers from New York, and one of the largest surviving fragments, an 11-meter granite Doric column, was meant to become part of a college that was never actually built. The column was transported to a small town called Woodridge in New York State and simply left there because hauling it back turned out to be too difficult and too expensive. It's still lying there today. Some of the sculptures ended up in museums. One of the female knight allegorical figures, for instance, now stands in the sculpture garden of the Brooklyn Museum. And 2 eagles that had remained right next to the modern Penn Station vanished during renovations in 2019, only to have one of them reappear 6 years later, in 2025, cleaned up and installed on a new public plaza nearby. What emerges is a strange and oddly poetic picture. A station that was meant to unite an entire city ended up, after its destruction, scattered across the entire country. Piece by piece, eagle by eagle, there's an even more personal story tucked into this mosaic. One railroad mechanic, named Albert Fritsch, picked up a broken fragment of yet another eagle's head during the demolition itself and took it home, simply as a keepsake from the job, where he'd spent years of his life. For decades, this fragment sat in his family's private collection, until much later, researchers studying the station's history tracked down this trace and put the fragment on display in a museum as part of an exhibit on Penn Station's demolition. It's a small but telling detail. For some people, the destruction of the station was a political or economic decision. For others, it was a personal loss so tangible that they literally carried pieces of it home in their coat pocket. But the most important consequence of this tragedy didn't happen at the dump. It happened in a courtroom. And this is where the story comes full circle. Interestingly, Grand Central Terminal itself was originally built specifically as a rival to Penn Station. When it opened in 1913, the competing New York Central Company deliberately wanted to outshine its main rivals at the Pennsylvania Railroad in sheer opulence. Construction cost nearly $160 million at the time. That's over $4 billion in today's money. The city's two greatest stations were literally competing over which one could impress passengers more. The public shock over the destruction of Penn Station became the direct catalyst for creating New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965, just 2 years after the demolition began. That law went on to save tens of thousands of historic buildings all across the city. But the toughest test of this law came precisely with the neighboring station. By the mid-1970s, Grand Central itself was in a state of decay. The ceiling had browned from cigarette smoke and diesel fumes. The windows were coated in soot, and homeless people slept in the main concourse, while petty drug dealers worked the area around them. Rail travel seemed like an outdated, dying mode of transportation. So few people saw any point in spending money to maintain such a giant. In 1968, the very same company that had destroyed Penn Station, by then renamed Penn Central, proposed building a massive office tower directly above and around Grand Central, designed by the renowned architect Marcel Breuer. One version of the proposal even called for demolishing part of the station's facade to create a unified look for the new tower. Critics at the time described the tower as looking like a shoebox lid standing on its side. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, the very same body that had been created because of the loss of Penn Station, rejected the company's proposal, calling it essentially an aesthetic joke. Penn Central sued the city, arguing that banning construction on its own land amounted to an unlawful violation of property rights. In 1975, a New York state court unexpectedly sided with the company and revoked Grand Central's landmark status. Yet that's when someone nobody expected stepped into the story. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the former First Lady of the United States, who had just settled permanently in New York, read about the court's decision in the newspaper and called the campaign's organizers herself the very next day. On January 30th, 1975, at a press conference held right inside the station's legendary Oyster Bar restaurant, she joined a former mayor of New York and a group of architects, among them, once again, Philip Johnson, to announce the formation of the Committee to Save Grand Central. She publicly declared that even at the 11th hour, it still wasn't too late to change course if society truly wanted to fight for it. And in a personal letter to the mayor at the time, she wrote that the city shouldn't be allowed to die by degrees, losing piece after piece of everything that could inspire future generations. Thanks to her public profile, the case drew national attention. Supporters of the preservation effort even organized a special train to Washington, nicknamed the Landmark Express, to draw attention to the upcoming Supreme Court hearing that on June 26, 1978, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Penn Central Transportation Company v. City of New York. The court upheld the landmarks law by a vote of 6-3, finding that restricting development above the station did not amount to an unlawful taking of property, since the company could still use the terminal for its intended purpose and continue earning a profit from it. This decision didn't just save Grand Central. It became the foundation of modern historic preservation law across the entire United States, a ruling that courts still cite today and that law students study in their very first year. In other words, the same company that had demolished one station with its own hands tried, 15 years later, to do exactly the same thing to another one. And the very tragedy it had caused came back around and stopped it. Today, Grand Central Terminal is one of the most visited and most beautiful structures in New York, restored at public expense after the owning company went bankrupt. And right next to the modern underground Penn Station, the Moynihan Train Hall opened in 2021, a reconstructed building that was once the old Main Post Office, designed by the very same architects, McKim, Mead and White, back in 1914. It isn't the same building, but it's the closest thing the city has managed to do to correct a mistake it made to itself half a century earlier. The story of Penn Station isn't just a sad tale about a demolished building. It's a vivid lesson in how easily a society can permanently lose something irreplaceable when it's guided only by short-term financial logic. No amount of money from selling air rights ever made up for what New York lost in October 1963, and the decision to destroy it was made by a small handful of people, while the consequences of that decision are still felt by every new generation of city residents today, every time they're squeezed into the cramped underground corridors of the current station. At the same time, this story also shows the opposite. Sometimes the greatest losses become the catalyst for changes that protect everything else. Without the tragedy of Penn Station, the landmarks preservation law might have appeared decades later, or maybe never at all. And Grand Central today might also be nothing more than a photograph in an archive, instead of one of the most visited destinations in the city. And perhaps the most important lesson here isn't really about architecture at all. It's about how a heritage's true value often only becomes obvious to a society after it's already been lost. And whether we're willing to act before it's too late depends entirely on us, not on architects or politicians. Today, millions of people pass through the underground Penn Station every single day, with no idea that this very spot once held one of the most magnificent public spaces in American history, and that fragments of that space are still scattered across the country, from a zoo in Washington to a tiny island in the state of Maine. If this story grabbed you, I've got dozens more like it. Abandoned Soviet palaces of culture, European cities destroyed by war and rebuilt from nothing but old photographs, and buildings that were only ever meant to be temporary, but ended up standing for over 100 years. Hit like if you want more deep dives like this into forgotten architectural masterpieces. Subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, which destroyed or forgotten building should I cover in the next video? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.